I want to talk to you about how to turn your podcast into a video podcast. So here's an overview I want you to pay attention to. So it's important to have a clear idea about the different video podcast styles before we talk about how to do the transformation. Okay. And the thing is, you have to understand the goal with the video is to provide relevant, helpful video information that simple audio doesn't have. So the first format is the PowerPoint style. So basically what happens here is that this is probably the best option for the most traditional podcasters. So if you already have a production workflow, or a backlog of recorded material, adding a straightforward PowerPoint video element is about as simple as an approach as you can take. And the good thing is it's not difficult. You don't need to be an expert with Microsoft PowerPoint to actually nail this technique down. And think of approaching it as if you are giving a PowerPoint or pitch deck presentation and you needed slides to go along with your script or speech. And so whether you are using simple images or text on screen, creating a podcast with visual elements to help illustrate your talking points can actually be quite powerful. And especially if you use some basic editing tips and tricks to add some animation and simple motion graphics, it will just be fantastic. The bottom line here is you want to keep things simple. You want to keep things on point. And most importantly, you want to actually use visuals and graphics and illustrations that appeal to your target audience. See, when we talk about podcasting in general, the most important person here is the listener. It's not you. You are just a podcaster. You are conveying information. And but it is the listener. So choose graphics that appeal to the listener. And most importantly, you want to choose graphics that basically can speak 1,000 words. What I'm trying to say here is that one graphic can be equal to 1,000 words if it is the right graphic. It's all about synchronicity. It's all about harmony. This is very important. And so number one, PowerPoint style. If you want to turn your podcast into video podcast, choose the PowerPoint style. By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. We are going to have a wonderful show. I want to talk to you about number two, something we call the live stream style. So another style which many podcasters are quick to adapt for adding video is the straightforward live stream approach. And it can be as simple as setting up an affordable action camera like a GoPro in your recording space and capturing the entire podcast as a live stream. And of course, you can live stream it, right? So from Facebook to Vimeo to Twitch, live streaming can be a great way to connect with your fans. And in many instances, it gives you that video element you can upload after the fact for people to watch and listen to later. So what am I trying to say here? So if you have a podcast and you are trying to turn your podcast into a video podcast, just install a camera. Just have a camera in the room and just make sure that the camera is on and the whole thing is recorded. That way you have audio and video. Now, the thing is, when we talk about adding, if you add a camera into the room where you're currently at, where you currently are at, you need to actually be presentable, right? So, because once you add a visual elements, you need to be presentable. This is sort of similar to if you have a guest on a radio show versus you have a guest on a TV show. Things are a little different. So what I'm trying to say here is that when you add an element of when you add a visual elements through the camera into your podcast, make sure that you are presentable. Make sure that you are thinking about what you're saying. Make sure that you also need to be prepared. Because the bottom line here is that the audience is going to connect with you, not only in terms of the sound, in terms of audio quality, but also in terms of video quality. So video quality means what? It means that the camera that you actually have, the settings must be good in terms of the resolution of the picture. So picture quality must be good. It must be sharp. This is an important element. And this is what I'm just telling you. If you want to make things a little faster, just make sure that if you connect with the platforms such as Facebook or Vimeo or Twitch, make sure that you check your internet connection, that you check your settings, that the image quality is great for your listener, and in this case, your viewer. Because if you are switching to a video podcast format, then you have viewers as well. By the way, boss, I want to quickly talk to you about today's topic. I want to remind you about today's topic. I'm actually explaining to you how to turn your podcast into a video podcast. The third style here is YouTube vlog style. If you want to go on the higher production quality and you can actually make YouTube and vlog style video, this is a great option here. And the thing is that, I only say YouTube because there are so many famous YouTubers who are often basically doing a podcast setup, but focused on the video elements and on-camera performance. And the thing is that this style employs much more production time and editing, since you'll often be setting multiple shots and splicing things together more tightly. But it can also be much more lucrative and the true next step in the video podcast game. So the thing is, when you think about YouTube, if you want to do a YouTube vlog style and you have a podcast, in other words, instead of you talking, you want to have a camera rolling. It's important to understand that the YouTube platform has different roles. They are different from, say, a TikTok or a Facebook or a Twitch or Instagram. And on YouTube, it's important to really pay attention to viewer engagement. You want to also think about the tags. You want to think about the SEO. All those are elements that are important. Now, if you want to do a vlog style and you don't want to put, let's say, tags and like the metadata in your video, this is possible if you are already known. In other words, folks are searching for you based on your name. But if you are an aspiring podcaster and you're trying to really gain traction on the platform, you need to actually you need to rank for certain key terms, for certain keywords here. This is why you need to pay attention to the description of your vlog. You need to pay attention to the metadata here. Those are important elements, but this is actually possible. So if you want to turn your podcast, let's say your audio podcast, into a video podcast, having a YouTube vlog style is about the best. I mean, YouTube being the quintessential video platform, YouTube has all the capabilities and features that you need to actually transform your podcast automatically into a video podcast. As a matter of fact, by the way, YouTube has created also recently, they have right now audio podcast. So they have a YouTube podcast on the platform. So you have that capability as well. Another interesting way to actually turn your podcast into a video podcast is what we call the static image podcast. And so basically, this is what it is. This is exactly how it sounds like, a static image podcast. What does that mean? It means that you just show a static image. This is an ideal solution for those short on time. So creating a video podcast with a static image is incredibly simple. So you want to record your podcast audio as normal, upload it to a basic editing software program, and simply add an image or slideshows of images over the top. And you want to export this as a video file, and voila, you got yourself a video podcast. Now, this may sound a little straightforward, but don't be afraid to get a little creative with the whole thing. So a static image can be anything you can choose, from cartoons to professional photographs of your podcast host and guests. If you're feeling especially creative, highlighting the photo of the guest who's talking to help the audience visualize them in a discussion is totally great. So the bottom line here is that you need to be creative in terms of what really can appeal to your audience. Going back to what I said about, it's all about the audience. It's all about the listener. It's all about the viewer. And the thing is that if you are trying to use a static image podcast, have the viewer, have the listener in mind. Now, in this case, it's not the listener, it's the viewer. If the image is too static, you risk boring listeners. You need to have something like, there has to be some kind of action on the screen. It doesn't have to be like videos. It doesn't have to be like footage, but it has to be something that is that's appealing to your audience, that creates some kind of value, right? It's all about creating value. It's all about adding value. So you want to engage, and engagement is really important, especially if you are on a platform such as YouTube or Twitch. Engagement is important. You don't want your podcast listeners and viewers to drop off the podcast. You want to hold them as long as possible, and you can do this by having interesting images that resonate with your target audience. Another way to turn your podcast into a video podcast is to have an in-studio podcast. And this is actually one of the easiest because it's one of the tested and like the proven formats here. And an ideal podcast recording type is the one that I just told you, especially if you have the necessary space. In-studio recording typically involves a recorded conversation between the podcast host and their guests in a studio or room. That's what you probably heard of. You've seen this many times. So this type of podcast is common, providing value to audiences, proving popular with audiences, helping them to connect with the speakers during the conversation as if they were in the room with them. Okay. However, you need to ensure you have an appropriate space or studio to record and shoot your podcast, setting up multiple cameras depending on the number of speakers you will have to focus on. And so this will inevitably take longer than a simple static image podcast, with the level of production and editing required far more complicated and precise. So what am I trying to say here? You need to have the resources. And by resources, I mean financial resources, logistical resources, human resources. You need to have the staff for that. Okay, you need to have the equipment for that. And you need to also you gotta have the room, of course. You gotta think about the logistics. So all those things are important. But yeah, this is actually the podcast format that most audiences around the world are accustomed to. When people think about podcasting in general, they're thinking about a room where you have guests. They're sitting, they're discussing something important, and so you can actually connect with the guests more closely. Now, one thing I want to say also is that it's one of those things you have to like when you start your podcast, you can actually just go with a static image or something else. You don't have to do you don't have to do the in-studio podcast right away, because this demands more resources. Okay, start little. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to turn your podcast into a video podcast. Let me talk to you now about the Monologue podcast. So Monologue podcast is it's a fantastic tool. Also, it's a fantastic format for you to consider, especially if you have a small team or no team. You're a podcast, you're a beginner, and you're trying to really test the waters and see what really works for you, what works for your audience. This is a great strategy. So this is best suited for individual content creators. The Monologue podcast allows the host to record their podcast in front of a camera, often sharing their thoughts on a specific topic. Okay, it's really, really an important element. And again, if you choose the Monologue podcast, all attention is on you. All eyes are on you. So acting as the center of attention for the entirety, podcast host will talk openly about their thoughts, feelings, experiences, or insider knowledge on a specific subject. And Monologues podcasts are common on platforms such as YouTube, with hosts discussing topics as diverse as business, content production, gaming, or politics. And so this is really an important element. Now, one thing I want to say is that if you are trying to have a Monologue podcast, make sure that you have the proper equipment, but also make sure that you are comfortable on camera. Okay, you got to be comfortable on camera. You got to be able to to hold a conversation with the camera. In other words, you got to hold a conversation with yourself. If you're not used to it, it might look a little weird to you at the beginning that you're talking to yourself, or you're talking to a camera, you're talking to a piece of equipment. But after a while, it gets better. And it's important to keep at it. It's important to keep doing it, to try it over and over and over. So you get the level of expertise that you need to have. The bottom line here is that the audience will figure out whether you're having fun or not. The audience will reward you for it. The audience will encourage you, will engage with you, will engage with your content. But yeah, a monologue podcast is a great way to turn your podcast into a video podcast. And again, you don't have to do anything. You just set up a video, just sit down, have a chair, and have a conversation. But you got to be able to talk, though. You got to be able to hold a conversation on a topic over several minutes. So let me give you the approach you need to think about here. So what you need to if you want to record video podcasts, you do need to have a basic set of equipment. Okay. The thing is that if you've been working with podcasting, you should know a bit about audio recording and what types of microphones you need, right? For video, depending on your style, you can get away with anything from recording directly to a smartphone, laptop, or action camera, upwards to shooting on any level of digital camera. For those not too familiar with video though, lighting is a chief concern, so it's important also to recognize that podcasts are generally long form, stretching anywhere from a couple of minutes to a couple of hours. And this is important now. Recording for long periods can be tricky for some cameras and setups. So do your research before investing in a good camera for recording your podcast. And also, let's talk about editing. So editing video podcasts. So the same is true for when it comes to video editing. And so when working with the simplest PowerPoint styles, you are still going to be creating long videos. And long videos mean long uploading, rendering, and exporting times, as well as large files. And you'll quickly learn that in the world of video production, the editing process can last upwards of 10 times longer than the actual filming. So this is important. So what you want to do is you can actually, you can start with shorter video podcasts at first with basic edits, and you can make things more sophisticated as you go on, but be prepared for a lot of lost time while waiting for exports. Okay. So, but if you have a team, things are a lot faster, but it's one of those things I was just talking to you about earlier when I mentioned the logistics. So it's not just about you sitting down and just recording a podcast. It's about what happens before and what happens after. You know, if you have a team to actually take care of the editing for you, that's fine. But if you don't have a team and you have to do things yourself, then you have to really account for that time also. And again, remember that when we talk about podcasting, this is a long-term game. So it's not just about you being successful today, but it's about you being successful over and over and over a long period of time. So sustainability becomes a quintessential element in that strategy. Okay, so you gotta have that, and you gotta think about it. But you gotta think about it over the long run. All right, let's quickly recap here. So in today's conversation, I explained to you how to turn your podcast into a video podcast. I gave you the overview, so I shared with you the different formats you got to think about. So the PowerPoint style, the live stream style, the YouTube vlog style, the static image podcast, the in-studio podcast, and the monologue podcast. And I give you the approach here in terms of what you need before actually recording a video podcast, and also how to edit video podcast. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll speak to you another time, but until then, remember, stay marvelous.